In the small, quiet town of West Virginia, Velma Thomas was known by all as a kind-hearted soul, a woman whose faith and love for her family and community were the cornerstone of her existence. As a mother, grandmother, and friend, she was the glue that held her loved ones together. People would often marvel at her resilience, her grace in the face of life's challenges, and the unwavering strength with which she weathered the storms of life. Little did anyone know, however, that on an ordinary day in 2008, Velma's life would take an unexpected and miraculous turn. This is the extraordinary tale of her miraculous return from the brink of death and the profound message she brought back from beyond the veil. The unthinkable. Velma's heart attack. October 2008 was like any other autumn month in West Virginia. The trees had begun to shed their golden leaves, and the crisp mountain air filled the homes with a sense of warmth and quiet. Velma, who had always been active and strong, had just finished her daily routine when something inside her body felt wrong. At first, she brushed it off as a passing discomfort, a minor ache or a fleeting moment of exhaustion. But as the pain intensified, it became clear that something was terribly amiss. She felt a crushing tightness in her chest, a heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. Her breathing became shallow, and the pain radiated through her body like an unstoppable wave. It was a heart attack, and it was happening fast. Her family, startled by her sudden distress, rushed to her side. Her son Tim, who had always been close to her, could see the panic in his mother's eyes and immediately called for emergency help. Paramedics arrived within minutes and worked quickly to stabilize her, but as they transported her to the hospital, the situation grew increasingly dire. The struggle to save her. Upon arrival at the hospital, the medical team sprang into action. They could see that Velma was in grave condition. A massive heart attack had caused her heart to struggle in pumping blood effectively to vital organs, depriving her body of the oxygen it desperately needed. The medical professionals moved swiftly, employing defibrillators to shock her heart into rhythm and administering medications meant to stabilize her fragile body. For hours, they fought valiantly to restore her heart's function. But despite their best efforts, Velma's condition deteriorated. She was slipping further and further away from life, her body unresponsive to every life-saving technique. Despite the full team working tirelessly around her, Velma's heart stopped completely. Her pulse was gone, and her body turned cold. The hospital room, once filled with the frantic beeping of monitors and the rush of medical professionals, was now silent. Doctors and nurses labored over her lifeless body, applying chest compressions and giving everything they had to bring her back. But after hours of failed attempts, the heart-wrenching reality set in. The medical team had exhausted all options. Velma's body had been deprived of oxygen for far too long, and it seemed there was no hope left. Her brain was no longer responding, and tests confirmed what everyone feared. She had died. A family in mourning. The decision to declare Velma clinically dead was one of the hardest that any doctor could make. Her family was devastated, shocked by how quickly things had gone from bad to worse. Her son Tim, in particular, was inconsolable. Having been especially close to his mother throughout his life, he found himself gripped by a profound sense of loss and confusion. In the quiet aftermath, there was nothing left to do but say goodbye. The hospital staff gave the family time to grieve, turning off the machines that had kept Velma's body functioning. The room was somber, filled with the heavy weight of sorrow. Her family sat around her body, embracing one another, whispering prayers and sharing stories about the incredible woman Velma had been. She had always been a beacon of love and faith, a woman who gave everything she had to her family and her community. Now all they had were memories, a quiet, haunting weight. As the family stayed by her side, the world outside moved on, unaware of the profound tragedy unfolding inside that room. Time ticked on, but Velma's family was in the throes of deep grief, trying to understand how life could be so cruel. Her life was filled with joy, kindness, and love, and now all that remained was an empty, cold shell in a hospital bed. Her youngest grandchild, too young to fully grasp what was happening, asked a heartbreaking question. When is Grandma waking up? The question hung in the air, like a knife to the heart, as her family struggled to process the reality that she was truly gone. They spoke softly to Velma's still body, reminiscing about the good times, the laughter, and the love she had brought to each of their lives. There was solace in these shared memories, but also an undeniable sense of devastation. They prayed for peace and understanding, though they all feared that they might never find it. A sign of hope, the unbelievable miracle. Then, something remarkable happened. The family had started to leave, some attending to the inevitable arrangements, others still clinging to the hope that some miracle might occur, despite the doctor's grim prognosis. Tim stayed behind, unable to walk away from his mother's side. As he sat in the chair beside her, his mind wandered through thoughts of anger, confusion, and profound sadness. He had been praying fervently, asking for one last miracle, but he was beginning to lose hope. But then, something impossible occurred. Velma's hand twitched. It was a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but it was real. Tim, who had been watching his mother with a mixture of grief and exhaustion, sat upright in his chair, his heart racing. He leaned closer, hoping, almost afraid to believe what he had just seen. The twitching happened again, this time more noticeably. Could it be? Tim whispered her name, his voice trembling with disbelief. But there was no response. At first, he thought it might be a trick of his mind, a sign of post-mortem reflex. But then, as the nurse entered the room to finalize the arrangements, she too noticed something odd. A faint pulse, just a flicker of life on the monitor. The nurse rushed to check the machine, assuming it was malfunctioning, but no, it was real. There, in the body of a woman who had been declared dead for 17 hours, was a pulse. Tim could hardly believe his eyes, and the nurse's voice cracked as she called for help. "We've got something here," she shouted. A revival beyond understanding. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, shocked to see that the impossible was happening. Velma's body was coming back to life. Her skin, once cold and pale, started to regain some warmth. Her chest moved slightly as if trying to breathe again. Her pulse grew faint, but it was undeniably there. It was the beginning of what would become a miraculous revival, something no one present could explain. The medical team sprang into action, administering oxygen, monitoring her vitals, and trying to stabilize her body. For all their medical knowledge and experience, no one could have predicted this moment. Velma had been declared clinically dead for an unimaginable length of time. And yet, she was now showing signs of life. The awakening, a message from beyond. The hours that followed were filled with wonder and astonishment. Velma's vital signs grew stronger and her breathing became steadier. By the morning, the doctors had removed some of the interventions, and Velma's body was functioning on its own. She was alive. But the miracle didn't end there. Velma had returned from the brink of death, but she had a story to tell, one that would shake the very foundations of everything her family thought they knew about life and death. When Velma finally opened her eyes, her first words stunned everyone in the room. "I wasn't here," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Her family leaned in, desperate to understand. "I left my body," she continued, as she tried to articulate what had happened during those 17 hours. She spoke of a brilliant light, warm and inviting, one that surrounded her and filled her with a sense of peace and love. She saw spirits, unspoken but undeniably present, waiting for her. They offered no words but conveyed a sense of understanding and encouragement. Velma felt no fear, no pain. Instead, she felt free, unburdened by the weight of her earthly life. She described how she had been told it was not yet her time, and how, with a heavy heart, she knew she needed to return to complete a mission, to share a message of love, faith, and hope. The message: love, faith, and purpose. Her words were not just those of someone who had experienced a near-death experience. They were words filled with conviction, words that came from a place of profound understanding. "Love is what matters," she said, her voice calm yet powerful. "Everything else, fear, regret, anger, none of that matters in the end. What matters is the love we share and the faith we have." Velma's story was more than just a tale of survival. It was a call to action, a reminder of the deeper connections that bind us all. She knew she had been given a second chance at life, but this time it was with a purpose, a mission to share what she had seen, what she had felt. The ordinary day that changed everything. Velma Thomas was a woman whose life was shaped by the values of kindness, faith, and family. She was known in her community in West Virginia as a devoted mother, grandmother, and friend. With a quiet resilience, Velma weathered the many challenges life threw her way, always grounded in her belief that faith, hope, and love were the cornerstones of life. Her days were filled with simple joys: baking for her family, tending to her garden, and offering a listening ear to those in need. Velma was the type of person who radiated warmth and security, someone whose presence made everyone around her feel safe and cared for. But on October 2nd, 2008, Velma's life was forever changed. It began as any other day, mundane and routine. She had been in good health, though a little tired from the usual duties of life. That morning, however, things took a sharp turn. Velma began to experience sudden chest pains, sharp, unrelenting, and frightening. At first, she assumed it was a result of stress or fatigue, but as the pain intensified, so did her concern. Her shortness of breath left her feeling lightheaded, and soon it became clear that something was gravely wrong. It was not just a passing discomfort. She was in the throes of a medical emergency. Her family rushed to her side, fearing the worst. They called for emergency medical help, and within minutes, the paramedics arrived at her home. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of frantic motion as Velma's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her heart was struggling, failing to pump blood effectively through her body. Doctors in the emergency room immediately sprang into action, working frantically to save her life. Chest compressions were performed, medications were administered, and a defibrillator was used in an attempt to restart her heart. The scene in the hospital was chaotic. The emergency team worked tirelessly, using every method available to resuscitate Velma. But despite their best efforts, her heart continued to fail. The hours ticked by with no sign of improvement. At one point, Velma's heart stopped beating altogether, plunging her body into a state of clinical death. For those in the room, there was a chilling silence that fell over them as the monitor's steady beat began to slow, finally flatlining. Yet, in a display of medical determination, the staff refused to give up. The team continued with chest compressions and life-saving techniques, but time was working against them. The hospital staff conducted further tests to assess her brain activity, but all signs pointed to the same grim conclusion. There was no brain function. Velma's family, having already witnessed the extensive efforts to revive her, were told by the medical professionals that there was no hope. The damage to her heart and brain was irreversible. A heart attack had deprived her brain of oxygen for far too long, and with no detectable signs of life, Velma was declared clinically dead after several hours of failed attempts to revive her. The weight of grief. The grief that swept over her family was unbearable. Her son Tim, in particular, found it nearly impossible to accept. Tim had always been extremely close to his mother. She was his rock, his source of strength, and the one who had always been there for him. He felt as though his world had collapsed in an instant. The doctors had made their decision, but for Tim, it didn't feel real. How could this vibrant, loving woman who had been a fixture in his life be gone? It was an incomprehensible loss. The family members were given time to say their goodbyes. The room grew quiet, save for the hushed sobs of loved ones and the soft sounds of whispered prayers. Some were more vocal in their grief, holding her hand and speaking to her as if they could somehow will her back to life. Others sat in a heavy silence, struggling to make sense of what had happened. In the corner of the room, Velma's oldest friend, who had heard the tragic news, arrived to pay her respects. She brought with her an old, well-worn Bible that Velma had given her years before. It was a small gesture, but one that meant everything in that moment. The friend sat beside Velma's bedside and recited scripture aloud, offering some semblance of peace in the midst of the chaos and sorrow. The words from the Bible brought comfort to some, but to others they were simply a stark reminder of the finality of life. Velma was gone, and no amount of faith or prayer could change that. Tim, despite his overwhelming grief, continued to cling to the hope that somehow, some way, his mother might still be with him. Though logic and reason told him otherwise, he couldn't let go of that fragile thread of hope. He continued praying, asking for a sign, even as the inevitable felt so close at hand. As hours passed, the painful reality of her death began to sink in. Family members made arrangements for the next steps, which felt like a cruel process to endure. They had to plan for a funeral, and the weight of those decisions, so final and harsh, seemed almost too much to bear. The details seemed trivial in comparison to the loss they were facing, yet it was a necessary part of the painful process. Even as grief consumed the room, there was a palpable sense of love that still held everyone together. Stories of Velma's life, the love she had shared, the kindness she had given, and the many ways she had made her family and community a better place, began to fill the space. These memories, though bittersweet, helped to keep the darkness at bay, even if just for a moment. Velma's warmth and wisdom had left an indelible mark on everyone she encountered, and now, in the face of her death, that love was shining through in the stories that were shared. In a moment of innocence and heartbreaking clarity, Velma's youngest grandchild, who was far too young to understand the gravity of what had happened, asked, "When is Grandma waking up?" That question, posed in pure confusion, broke hearts in the room. In that moment, everyone was reminded of the painful finality of death. Yet, as they mourned and prepared for the inevitable, none of them could have predicted what was about to unfold. The miracle, a return to life. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. After hours of being declared clinically dead, Velma's body, which had been lifeless and cold, began to show faint signs of life. It was subtle at first, a small twitch in her hand. Tim, sitting beside her in quiet disbelief, thought it might just be a post-mortem reflex. But then another movement, a bit more distinct. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was she really? A nurse entered the room to finalize the arrangements for Velma's body to be transported to the morgue. As she approached the bed, she saw something unexpected, a faint pulse on the monitor. At first, the nurse thought it was a malfunction, but after double-checking, it was clear. There was life, however faint, returning to Velma's body. The pulse was weak and irregular, but it was unmistakable. The nurse, unsure of what she was seeing, quickly called for help. Soon, doctors and nurses crowded the room, their expressions a mix of confusion, awe, and urgency. They had declared her dead hours ago. The doctors checked for brain activity, expecting to find none. But, to their astonishment, there were faint electrical signals, tiny but present. Something impossible was happening. Velma, who had been dead for 17 hours, was alive. Her pulse grew stronger as the medical team rushed to stabilize her. Oxygen was administered, and doctors worked quickly to assess her vitals. It was a surreal moment that seemed to defy every medical explanation. The staff had seen many cases of cardiac arrest, but never one like this. Never had they witnessed someone being revived after so long, especially with brain activity still present. Tim, sitting by her bedside, could barely comprehend what was happening. His mother, who had been cold and lifeless just moments before, was now showing signs of life. His voice quivered as he whispered, "She's alive." A doctor, equally stunned, could only confirm, "There's something faint, but it's there." The staff worked tirelessly to stabilize her condition. As Velma's vitals continued to improve, something miraculous began to unfold before them. Her skin, once cold to the touch, began to regain warmth. Her breathing, once shallow, began to regulate. It was as if life itself was returning to her, against all odds. By morning, Velma's condition had improved enough that some of the medical interventions were no longer necessary. The doctors had expected irreversible damage to her brain due to the prolonged oxygen deprivation, but instead, she had defied all odds. She was alive. It was as if a new chapter had begun in her life, one that no one could have predicted. The revelation, a message from beyond. As Velma regained strength and her mind became clearer, she opened her eyes for the first time since her miraculous return. Tim, still by her side, held her hand and called her name, tears streaming down his face. She looked at him, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. A weak smile crossed her face, and in that moment, Tim's heart leapt. His mother was back. The doctors, though astonished, began to assess her cognitive abilities, asking her simple questions. To their surprise, she answered them all correctly, with no signs of confusion or cognitive impairment. It was as though she had come back from the brink of death with a clarity that defied all expectations. But it wasn't just her physical recovery that amazed everyone. It was what she spoke of when she was able to communicate. Velma, still weak but regaining her strength, began to recount an extraordinary experience. In the moments after her heart had stopped and her body had been declared dead, she had gone somewhere. She described a sense of floating, of moving through a tunnel toward a bright light. She felt a peace unlike anything she had ever known. Velma spoke of seeing loved ones who had passed before her, offering her comfort and reassurance. They greeted her with smiles and love, but they did not tell her that it was her time to stay. Instead, they told her that she had been given a second chance and that her time was not yet up. As she shared this, the room fell silent. Her family listened in awe, struggling to process what Velma was saying. Tim, still in disbelief, held her hand tighter, afraid to let go in case this miracle might fade away. "I was surrounded by light," Velma said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. "I felt no pain, no fear, just a sense of complete peace. It was as though everything was in place and I was home. But I heard a voice telling me that it wasn't time for me yet. I was told that I had more to do, more to give." Velma's description of her experience was filled with vivid details that suggested an incredibly real and personal journey, one that transcended anything the family had ever imagined. She spoke of a feeling of being loved and protected, of being shown the beauty and grace of the afterlife, but also being given a choice, whether to stay or return to her earthly life. The family, hearing these words, found themselves wrapped in an overwhelming sense of awe and reverence. The medical staff too couldn't help but marvel at her story. While they had seen some unusual cases, none of them could explain how or why Velma had come back from the dead after so long. Her recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within days, she had regained full consciousness and was able to engage in conversations with her family and doctors. There were no signs of brain damage, no lasting effects from the hours she had spent without a heartbeat or brain function. It was as though her body had simply reset, and her mind had returned to her, intact and sharp as ever. As the days turned into weeks, Velma's physical health continued to improve, and she was soon able to walk again, though she had a sense of quiet wonder about her. The experience had changed her deeply. She wasn't the same woman who had gone into the hospital days before. While she was still the kind-hearted, loving person her family knew, there was now a quiet strength and a profound sense of purpose in her actions. She felt as though she had been given a mission, a calling, though she wasn't entirely sure what that might be. A message of faith and hope. In the months that followed, Velma often spoke to those around her about her experience and the peace she felt during the time she was unconscious. She encouraged others to never lose hope, no matter how dark their circumstances might seem. She spoke of the importance of love, faith, and the belief that there was always something greater than themselves guiding them, whether they could see it or not. "I don't know why I came back," Velma would say, "but I know I'm not finished yet. There is something more for me to do in this life, and I believe that no matter what happens, we're never truly alone. We have love, and we have each other. That's what matters most." Her words resonated with everyone who heard them. Velma's journey from death to life became a testament to the power of faith, love, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It was a story that touched hearts and sparked conversations about life, death, and the possibility of the miraculous. For Velma, her near-death experience was not something she could easily explain, but she didn't need to. The experience had left her with a deeper understanding of the preciousness of life. It had shown her that every moment was a gift, and that there was always a reason to keep fighting, even in the darkest times. She continued to live her life with an unwavering faith in the future, grateful for each new day. Though her miraculous return had puzzled doctors and amazed her family, Velma's greatest gift was not just her return to life, but the deepened sense of purpose and connection that it gave her and those around her. It was a reminder that miracles still happen, and that love and faith can transcend even death itself. A legacy of miracles. As the years passed, Velma continued to live her life with a renewed sense of joy and purpose. Her story became an enduring legacy of faith and hope. She spoke at churches, community events, and even to groups of medical professionals, sharing her experience and encouraging others to believe in the power of miracles, even when the odds seemed impossible. Tim, too, carried his mother's story with him, telling it to anyone who would listen. For him, it was more than just a miraculous event. It was the foundation of his own understanding of life and death. He realized that the love of family, the strength of faith, and the power of hope were things that could never be extinguished, no matter how dire the circumstances. Velma's return to life became a powerful reminder that the most profound changes in life often come when we least expect them. And as long as we hold on to love, faith, and hope, there is always a chance for a miracle, even in the darkest of times.